Okay, on to part 2 of the chapter 8 in Wendell Berry's book entitled Sex Economy, Freedom, and Community. And this chapter 8 has the same title, and I'm going through it in parts. So last time we covered part 1, now we're on to part 2. And I'll just say at the beginning that Berry's going to talk about the relationship of the economy to the community, the relationship of the community to personal relationships and sexuality and sexual relationships and marriage. And I myself have become fairly deeply ambivalent about marriage from a variety of sources and over a long period of time. And so, whereas Berry defines and I think in a way defends marriage by attempting to define it better, it sounds good to me, and yet I am, as I said, ambivalent. Of course, we've come a long ways even since Berry published this book, which is, what did I say? Oh, let me look again, 1993. So we've come a long ways since then, it seems to me, on the front of marriage. So anyway, I'll just go ahead and get started. He starts off this section saying to deal with community disintegration as merely a matter of sexual disorder, however destructive that disorder may be, is misleading. He says the problem is far more complex than that, and he launches right into a discussion of the economy. So, and characteristically, Berry links up the health of the economy with the health of marriage and sexual relations and just everything related to community. He says the destruction of the community begins when its economy is made not dependent, for no community has ever been entirely independent, but subject to a larger external economy. So that's a pretty strong statement, and one that many of us may not have really thought about. It may not have occurred to us that there's that great of a connection actually between the economy and sexual relations. And it may also not have occurred to many of us that we are dependent rather than independent. I think I've mentioned before that the capitalist economy and the ideology behind it does make people feel as though they're very independent. They can get into their car and they can go to a store, they can buy what they want if they've got a decent job anyway, and they can entertain themselves any way they want, etc., etc. But at the same time, what Berry likes to point out is how dependent people are. Ultimately, in such an economy, the more sophisticated it becomes, the less they do for themselves, the less they really can do for themselves. They begin to lack the basic skills, knowledge, social relations, and even equipment, physical equipment, as well as physical ability, I guess I would have to say, to actually take care of themselves. And of course, they are told, well, that's a rustic and undesirable way to live anyway, to take care of yourself when you can hire or buy what you need. People have mixed feelings about this kind of statement, but I think Berry leans towards, dependence is bad. Too much dependence softens a person and makes them less free. I think he more than leans in that direction. That's what he thinks. So, looking a little bit further in. He says of the same sort of thing, if you are dependent on people who you do not know, who control the value of your necessities, you are not free and you are not safe. So he takes it to another level there by pointing out the vulnerability of modern people, maybe especially people in cities, who are really from this other angle dependent for the very necessities of life on many, many things outside of their control. And I suppose he doesn't reference this, but I suppose you see that at times when a disaster, whether natural or man-made, happens and shuts down the various supplies of a city, and how quickly many people panic, maybe engage in looting and in behavior that they might not otherwise do, and can be in very short order in peril of losing their lives, and really kind of be waiting around for somebody to rescue them because they don't have any idea what to do, and really can't do very much because of the situation that they're in. Anyway, so that radical dependency makes a person not only not free, but not safe. And that reminds me of John Locke's discussion of the state of nature quite a long time ago, right? That an inspiration to the American founders, right? But his notion was that without access to property, he said, we could not be free and we could not be safe. If some entity was capable of taking away our property, it could easily take our lives. But then John Locke went on to argue that we would all be better off if we went down this path of more and more differentiated labor, just division of labor. And pretty soon he was at the point in the argument where he said, with a differentiated and more complex economy, the day laborer in England would be better off than the king in America, meaning a Native American chieftain. So ultimately, Berry and Locke don't agree, but there's this little nexus of agreement where, Locke and Berry both concede that if somebody can take away your property, they can take away your life. You're vulnerable. Berry, though, says to somebody like Locke or Adam Smith, the complexity of the capitalist economy takes away your property. How many people really own property in the sense that Locke maybe thought it would work, where property would allow you to really be able to safeguard yourself and be less vulnerable. So there's a little bit of the Marxian in Berry, who points out that the capitalist economy really doesn't give people that kind of property normally. Most people don't have, through property, more security, in other words. In fact, sometimes the more property, the less security in our experience with the type of debt and the amount of work that a person has to do to keep up with that debt when they have let's say, a large mortgage and they have a expensive car loan, etc., student loans, Okay, moving on and continuing again on the role of the economy. He says local communities and places can participate in this economy, this global economy, only as victims. The global economy does not exist to help the communities and localities of the globe. It exists to siphon the wealth of those communities and places into a few bank accounts. To this economy, democracy and the values of the religious traditions mean absolutely nothing, and those who wish to help communities to survive had better understand that a merely political freedom means little within a totalitarian economy. So, wow. Taking it to another level now, he's looking at the global economy, the global capitalist economy, and he's saying that it destroys localities. It destroys communities and localities, those places where people had for a long time, let's say, been able to do their own work and cooperate with each other to supply their basic needs. It destroys those in favor of this complexity, and then it creates dependencies, let's say, within countries as well as among countries. So that, that pretty soon nobody is actually able to to say, I can feed my family, maybe by myself or with my neighbors. We can feed our families here. No, we are dependent upon being able to find a job in a factory or a job in a particular, let's say, corporate farm or whatever it may be, so that I can make the money, which then I hope I will be able to go to the grocery store or whatever and buy what I need. So this idea of totalitarian economy, it's not totally new. We have, I don't know, I'm thinking of Sheldon Wollin's idea of inverted totalitarianism, which is a little bit different than that, but a similar concept. Or Jacques Ellul's notion of the totalitarian nature of technique, somewhat similar notion here. But it's a rare idea. This is not a typical idea. And the idea is foreign to many Americans, and maybe particularly conservative Americans, who tend to think the economy can never be oppressive. The quote, freer it is. The freer that those with capital are to be able to wield that and make money, the better off everybody will be. That's kind of the Lockean Smithian position, and they take it. So the idea that the economy could become totalitarian and oppress people, make them less free, less safe, more vulnerable, is just so foreign to our minds. And I think people tend to equate it with Marxism and everything bad that comes with Marxism, like, statist totalitarianism. They don't want to go there, right? But at the same time, Wendell Berry invites us to have the imagination to break from that way of thinking a bit. If we love freedom, if we say we want to be independent, have liberty, right? What do you have to have in order to make that happen? Can you really be at the total mercy of an external economy? Helpless, in effect, to be able to feed, shelter, clothe, protect yourself, take care of your elderly, take care of your children independently. Can you be free in any meaningful sense if you aren't free in a practical sense? So he invites us to really to break through our prejudices here and to think outside the box, to use a phrase that's maybe overused. Now, next he goes on and he talks about the Luddites and the Amish. Okay, this kind of gets Wendell Berry into trouble sometimes. I find that people have a hard time when Berry starts praising groups that many people see as retrograde, right? Certainly the Luddites, who, their very name has been turned into a pejorative term, I don't want to be a Luddite, which means I don't want to be backwards. I don't want to resist all change and progress, right? The Luddites were a group of working class people in England who in the 18th century began to protest against industrialization. He says these were people who dared to assert that there were needs and values that justly took precedence over industrialization, and they were people who rejected the determinism of technological innovation and economic exploitation. That's why he likes the Luddites, whom he would say have gotten a bad name, a bad rep. And because it wasn't that they were necessarily against all technological innovation, they were against the determinism of technological innovation, which is the idea that technological innovation, no matter what it is always good and always inevitable. Berry thinks that we need to control innovation according to our human priorities. So whereas we are like dithering about, what's going to happen when cloning fully comes of age, or gosh, are GMOs gonna end up killing off bees and then the entire population? Gosh, I guess we'll find out, as though we're not in control, which we really aren't, right? At this point in time, innovations, if they make economic sense, just succeed and keep going. But Berry, through discussions like this, is asking the question, shouldn't we first decide what it is that would be good for us? Sort of sounds like Plato there. First decide what is good for us for real, and then decide what technologies to use and how to use them. Instead of having the technologies ride us, we should be riding the technologies instead of having the technologies destroy us and our environment potentially, which you have to admit, that's what we're worried about, right, when it comes to the environment. Instead of that, shouldn't they be serving our priorities, which, if we think about them a bit, would have to include a healthy environment that can keep us going for hundreds of years to come? Anyway, he also mentions the Amish. Again, people have, like, they either love the Amish or they don't like them, but it's sort of a similar, notion. The Amish have decided they just are going to reject a lot of technology because they've prioritized a different way of life. So they're kind of out there on the extreme end of things, but that's why Berry's focusing in on the Amish there. He says near the end of all that discussion of the Luddites and the Amish, there's no denying that community ranks with family, our land, our beloved country as an icon of the public vocabulary. Everybody is for it, but this means nothing. So I think in contrast, see, with people who have maybe some notion of convictions when it comes to their community and are willing to try to preserve those and to develop their economy and their technology accordingly. When we talk about community these days, it's a sort of empty rhetorical flourish. It's an ideal that is empty of content. It's a feel-goodism. Next page he says, for when community falls, so must fall all the things that community life can engender and protect. So here he's talking about, again, he's already said, this economy that we have rips apart, tears apart, and destroys small communities. And now he's saying, so when they fall, what falls with them? And here he lists the care of the old. So instead of caring for the elderly ourselves when we can, the elderly prefer to go to nursing homes, preferably nice ones, so that they can feel independent while being completely dependent. But they're independent of their children. And children, of course, don't want to be sort of tied down by their parents. So that's what he's talking about there. The care of the old, the care and education of children. I don't think Berry's against public education per se, but he thinks that we put way too much emphasis on it, or we empower it too much. No, let's put it another way. We depend upon it too much to raise our children. That's a better way to put it. Childcare, maybe we overdo childcare in Berry's view from the point of view of actually taking responsibility for educating our children. He also lists family life falls apart. How's that? Well, I guess, some examples would be working too long and hard and not being with your wife or husband and your children or your extended family. With the extra money that you earn, maybe buying those gaming systems or engaging in some entertainment that sort of isolates everybody in their respective little spots so that they don't interact. I don't know. Anyway, eventually the breakdown of the family based on the alienation and the lack of a common purpose. He also lists neighborly work. That would be neighbors helping each other, which is, how many of us live in neighborhoods where we don't even know the neighbors, let alone ever think of, helping them out? Or how many have experienced this, where you try to help out a neighbor and they take great offense at the attempt because it impinges upon their privacy and their independence? How much of a neighborhood do you have when people have their backs up because you deign to, decide to mow down some of their weeds? I don't know. Um, I don't live in that kind of neighborhood. I've got a pretty good neighborhood. He also lists the handing down of memories, and the care of the earth, respect for nature, and the lives of wild creatures. So all of that becomes, sometimes we even hire it out. Handing down of memory just kind of stops. It because people go hither and yon in the differentiated capitalist economy, and spend a lot of time working, and there's just this sense of constant progress and innovation, so it becomes just ridiculous to pass down your family lore and expect your children to actually learn it, or your community lore. That's a thing of the past. And the care of the earth and nature and the lives of wild creatures assumes that you're looking around you and that you see some connection with all that. That it's not just your postage stamp yard and its little lawn that you've got to take care of, right? Because somebody expects you to. But that you might need these things out there to continue to live and thrive for your own well-being. He says, but of all the damaged things, probably the most precious and most damaged is sexual love. So here he brings this all back to the central point of the chapter. He says, for sexual love is the heart of community life. Sexual love is the force that in our bodily life connects us most intimately to the creation, to the fertility of the world, to farming, to the care of animals. It brings us into the dance that holds the community together and joins it to its place. So why does he do this? Why does he bring it all the way back here to sexual love between, I think he would probably say, because it produces children, a man and a woman. But I'm not sure he would preclude homosexual love here either, because sexual love is this deepest intimacy, at least it ought to be in Berry's eyes, but often is not, as we'll see. He goes on to explain that. But it's this deepest intimacy, which is supposed to be very private. That's what intimacy ought to mean. The sharing of love in this way is the very beginning of that core that he sees, the core institution of community, which is the family, both in the openness or production, the productivity, what am I trying to say? The fertility that people are supposed to have to create children. But even without that, just the intimacy and the safety of being able to express love in this way. It's the foundation of the care and concern for everything else. Okay. On the next page, he says, sexual energy cannot be made publicly available for commercial use, that is prostituted, without destroying all of its communal or cultural forms of courtship, marriage, family life, household economy, and so on. So, I mean, the thing that leaps to mind for him is advertisements, okay? He talks about the sexualization of advertisements again, and how this prostitutes this very, very precious intimacy. It erases it, you might say, so that it cannot be had. The more that people are exposed to this prostitution of sexuality, the less they can even imagine what that intimacy would be like. And then sexual relations becomes something other than that. The thing that leaps to my mind all these years later, from 1993, is the dating app, Tinder, or Bumble, or any number of these things, Christian Mingle, etc., right? Match.com. Those sites, I mean, some may say very useful for sort of cutting to the chase in our very confused world, where we don't know who's single or who's available or who's married, who's gay, who's straight, and nobody wants to talk to anyone else. They seem like a way of cutting through that so that you can find somebody, and I think many people have. But there's no getting around the fact that a lot of those folks are also seeking short-term sexual liaisons, right? And then that's becoming a major thing in our society. And those have the feel, as you're swiping left or right, of a sort of supermarket of human beings. And is it right to look at a person, their little blurb and their picture, and swipe left or right based on what little you see? Well, maybe we feel as though we have no choice. But you may want to think about that a bit, you know. And I'm sure Wendell Berry would have to be looking, and he's still alive. He probably is looking at that as just another manifestation of the prostitution of sexuality and the sort of, to use a sort of Marxian term, the commodification of sex and the body. Not the best from his point of view, I'm sure. Now he goes off into Shakespeare. I don't know the Merchant of Venice very well, of the Shakespeare plays. It's one that I've only seen, I think, once. So I'm not going to venture into that territory and not know what I'm talking about. But coming out of that discussion, we clearly love Shakespeare, and I should love it more. I do enjoy some Shakespeare, but I haven't taken the time to really know Shakespeare well. But coming out of that, he says some significant things that I've got like marked up. He says lovers must not, like usurers. Usurers are, like I'm sure in The Merchant of Venice, the usurer is the loan shark, right, or the person who charges interest for the loans. Anyway, live for themselves alone. They must finally turn from their gaze at one another back toward the community. If they had only themselves to consider, lovers would not need to marry, but they must think of others and of other things. They say their vows to the community as much as to one another, and the community gathers around them to hear and to wish them well on their behalf and on its own. It gathers around them because it understands how necessary, how joyful, how fearful this joining is. These lovers, pledging themselves to one another until death, are giving away themselves, and they are joined by this as no law or contract could ever join them. Lovers then die into their union with one another as a soul dies into its union with God. So here is his view, I think, a fairly nice, very nicely written ideal of marriage, right? For Berry, and I think this is a good point, you don't get engaged or get married unless you want to make a public statement. That's what engagement and marriage are all about. If you just want to have a private relationship and affair, which is, in my mind, no big deal. I'm not condemning that at all, okay? If you don't want to make a public proclamation, then don't get married, okay? Now, if that's so, then that implies that the community is a partner in the marriage, that the community is a big reason why to get married and what marriage is for. And so people in marriage, I would say engagement marriage, are making this public proclamation, for instance, this is my mate. You know, I kind of claim an exclusive right to this person. Okay. Now, I think Berry and I agree that that's a really tough thing to do. Like, it's one of the most challenging things a human being can do. Probably the only other most challenging thing would be celibacy, like lifetime celibacy of a priest or a nun. But the second hardest thing to do of a sexual nature is probably fidelity of a lifelong kind. So this is not some sort of commitment to just sort of go off half-cocked with and just go into lightly, and yet a lot of people in our society do, without understanding what it is they're really asking for. Um, Berry in The Unsettling of America points out that Americans have an awfully romantic notion of marriage, and this romanticism makes them think that if they once fall in love, which is really the liminal sort of ooh feely stage, that 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 they will never have to uh, sorry, temporarily interrupted. Anyway, so he gives us his ideal of marriage, and he's going to do more of that. But basically, if you don't want the community to be involved, and you don't want to turn your gaze back outward toward the community, then there's no real reason to get married. And marriage is hard, right? But it's also, I think in his eyes, it can be a very wonderful and deepening thing too. You just need to know exactly what you're getting into when you do it. I like this idea of turning your gaze back out towards the community, because if marriage is a true partnership between two people who really love each other, then they should be concerned with more than just themselves, both as individuals and each other, because that's a form of narcissism or, excessive self-love. People can just be to the point where even the marriage is just for them, right? And, so in other words, if the marriage doesn't perform and do for them what they think, then they're dissatisfied, right? Or it can be that the two are very much, in love with each other, but they're obsessively so that they can't actually perform anything good together for other people. But I think, in his vision of marriage, there's quite a bit of turning inward, of course, to receive the sustenance that an intimate relationship provides. But that is so that you can then turn outward and as a couple, be united in caring for and engaging with the rest of your family, your community, and your world. All right, so he then goes on to say, our present sexual conduct, having liberated itself, on the other hand, from the several trusts of community life, is public. Like our present economy, it has forsaken trust, for it rests on the easy giving and breaking of promises. Here he gets to the point of, the general trend in our society is serial relationships, divorces, broken engagements, broken living together arrangements, moving on to the next person. Frankly, it sounds very tiring, so I tend to agree with his dismay about all that. He says down at the bottom of this page, this is 139. I just figure I'm quoting from this part so you can find all this stuff. But he says the difficulty is that marriage, family life, friendship, neighborhood, and other personal connections do not depend exclusively or even primarily on justice, though of course they must all try for it. They depend also on trust, patience, respect, mutual help, forgiveness, in other words, the practice of love, as opposed to the mere feeling of love. Oh, there's a couple of really good ideas there. Number one, we tend to place a lot of emphasis on justice because we think in terms of contractualism in a society based on a capitalist economy. Everything becomes a contract, and marriage becomes a contract. And then it becomes a matter of justice. Am I getting what I contracted for? If I'm not, then I'm dissatisfied, and then I won't give. But human relationships, truly human relationships, are based on something else that is and can be very unequal at times and go back and forth, that have to do with very human qualities like trust, patience, respect, forgiveness, and things like that. So there's this notion of justice that he criticizes. And then also he makes a distinction between the practice of love and the feeling of love. Now, It's not that feelings are bad, and again, I doubt if Wendell Berry would say feelings are false or bad or whatever, but they do come and go. And I'm fond of saying love is a commitment, not a feeling, because of that. And I think that Berry agrees with that. The practice of love is the actual doing of care and of concern, of listening to somebody, of, pulling the weeds out of their strawberry bed. That's that's love. And it's particularly love when you do it even when you're not feeling warm and fuzzy. So I think that's what he's getting at there. And he says, as soon as the parties to a marriage or a friendship, which is another loving type of relationship that we often tend to forget, true friendship, it's a wonderful thing, begin to require strict justice of each other, then that marriage or friendship begins to be destroyed. Okay, that's pretty clear. So he spends some more time on sex and advertisements, but we get that point. Then he goes on to our cult of expertise, you might say. He says, in our liberated sexual environment, we are free of courtesy, ceremony, responsibility, and restraint, dependent on litigation and expert advice. There is much that is human, sad to say, but there is no sense or sanity. So, we do over-rely probably on a variety of expertise. And I just think that's something that he does mention from time to time elsewhere, our tendency to get the advice of somebody, not to follow our own. Maybe it's the sex therapist or your therapist more generally. I've got little underlines under this. He says, the pretentious, fantastical, and solemn idiocy of the public sexual code could not be better exemplified than by the now ubiquitous phrase sexual partner, which denies all that is implied by the names of husband or wife or even lover. It denies anyone's responsibility for the consequences of sex. I find this interesting because he notes here that we have a public sexual code that is wildly off from our actual sexual practice. And a little bit further on, he points out that we particularly apply this public sexual code to those who are famous, our politicians and our movie stars, and we like to gossip and wag our fingers at them. Meanwhile, we get on Tinder, swipe right, and have our hookup. So there's something to that. It is kind of weird. We have a country that has a puritanical heritage, right? We were founded by Puritans. There's still this Protestant Puritanism in our public sexual code, which doesn't square at all, and ever less so, with our actual sexual practice. Not that it should necessarily, it's just that there's this really weird contradiction there. It's just warped. It's kind of sick overall. So I like that Wendell Berry points that out. Moving on, he says, we are now living in a sexual atmosphere so polluted and embittered that women must look on virtually any man as a potential assailant, and a man must look on virtually every woman as a potential accuser. Well, I mean, campus politics and all that, and just like the wider social scene, you got to admit, there's a lot of fear there, right? There's fear. And of course, America's obsession with excessive drunkenness, followed by wagging our fingers at people who drink and don't get drunk, is another example of this kind of hypocrisy and this bipolar mentality that then creates situations where people get drunk and more or less assault each other. Sexual assault happens all the time because of this type of behavior now, right? So again, I can see a lot of our reality here. Now, he says that this is an interesting statement. He says, we presume to teach our young people that sex can be made safe by the use inevitably of purchased drugs and devices. What a lie. Sex was never safe, and it is less safe now than it has ever been. somehow I like that notion that sex is never safe. I think, based on everything he said, one of the reasons sex is never safe is because sex implies this vulnerability and intimacy with another person. So whether people realize it or not, they're opening themselves up. Now, of course, it's not safe because you're vulnerable to getting a disease. You've put yourself in the trust of this other person. You trust that they are truthful and that they will not harm you in this way, but you trust them that they will not assault you. You trust them that they will not talk about you. All of these things, right? But even more, you allow, if it goes the way Wendell Berry thinks it should go, you allow this person into your innermost life, and you're completely vulnerable to them. And that's the dangerous thing. But it's also the very seat of love and creativity. I think because of that vulnerability. And that's why it needs to be preserved, right? Then back to this notion of how we actually deal with sex and the commercialization of it and the prostitution of it. He says, we have liberated fantasy but killed imagination. Meaning, again, with the advertisements and with the movies and the television shows that have this sort of fantasy depiction of sex. And now we can certainly add, if we couldn't back in 1993, but probably we could then, sophisticated and awful internet porn into the mix of that. So he says, starting with economic brutality, we have arrived at sexual brutality. That's the ultimate consequence of the economic brutality of totalitarian globalized capitalism, in his view. Those who affirm the one, he says, and deplore the other will have to explain how we might logically have arrived anywhere else. Sexual lovemaking between humans is not and cannot be the thoughtless, instinctual coupling of animals. It is not recreation. It is not safe. It is the strongest prompting and the greatest joy that young people are likely to experience. Because it is so powerful, it is risky, not just because of the famous dangers of venereal disease and unwanted pregnancy, but also because it involves and requires a giving away of the self that, if not honored and reciprocated, inevitably reduces dignity and self-respect. Well, that kind of sums up his point of view in this section. I'll just mention one thing out of that might not have leapt out at you. He says that sexual relations are the strongest prompting and the greatest joy that young people are likely to experience. Now, if you read that, you might think, well, that is Wendell Berry saying that only young people have sex? No. He's saying that he's saying that it's probably the greatest joy that young people are likely to experience. Probably because as you get older, there are other even greater joys that can be experienced. That's the way Wendell Berry thinks, okay? And I would think that he would class among them the spiritual growth and the development of the strong friendship and community bonds, the great love that people can expand out to other people and to God and to nature. Those things may be even greater. And so I think that's what he's talking about there. Okay, I think I have covered all the important stuff there that I could think of in part 2. So in about a week, I plan on doing part 3. All right. Bye.